The chairs were empty again. Arbiter Veth Khan stood at the center of the conclave of worlds on the station known as Orath Meridian, a place old enough that its bones had been grown, not built, by a species no one remembered anymore. All 6 of his elongated hands rested on the Arbiter's console. He stared at the human delegations row. 14 days. 14 days of those 4 seats sitting there like wounds that hadn't closed. The holographic display panels above the seats were dark. The neural sync headsets, the ones calibrated specifically for human auditory range, were still resting in their cradles, exactly where Ambassador Yael Okonkwo had left them. She always set hers at a slight angle. They were still at that angle. Nobody had touched them. Nobody had thought to. Around him, the conclave chamber pulsed with the low overlapping frequencies of 9 species conducting the business of a galaxy, as though a 10th hadn't simply ceased to exist inside these walls, as though the silence from one corner of the room wasn't the loudest thing in it. The Sulhari delegate, a creature named Prith, whose species had evolved from ambush hunters and still moved like they were always deciding whether something was prey, leaned toward the Vicari envoy and said something in a register too low for the universal translators to catch. But Veth Khan saw the spinal crests along Prith's back ripple with what his species used instead of laughter. He caught a fragment. Something about held breath, about children testing limits. He did not find it amusing. 360 years, that was how long Veth Khan had held the Arbiter's seat. He had mediated border disputes between civilizations that communicated through ultraviolet light patterns. He had brokered peace between species whose biological cycles were so different that they existed, functionally, in different versions of the present. He had watched stellar empires dissolve and reform and dissolve again, and through it all, the conclave had endured because every species, no matter how alien, no matter how young, no matter how stubborn, you show up, you sit in the seat, you speak. Even when the speaking was theater, even when every delegate in the chamber knew the words meant nothing, you showed up. Because showing up was the treaty, because absence was the only act of aggression the conclave truly recognized, and the humans had committed it without a single weapon fired. He convened a sealed session that afternoon. 9 delegations compressed into the inner chamber, the air thick with competing atmospheric blends and the sharp metallic undertone of universal translators working at their limits. Veth Khan kept his voice procedural. He asked his communications directorate for a status report on human diplomatic channels. The technician who answered, a junior Orath analyst, her secondary eyelids blinking rapidly the way her species did when distressed, read from her data surface with careful, deliberate calm, as though each word required its own moment of courage. Every channel was dark, not damaged, not malfunctioning, deliberately severed. All 9 embassies, every trade consulate, every cultural exchange office, every military liaison station humanity had operated inside conclave space, shut down within a window of 7 minutes. The quantum lattice relay nodes that connected human space to the galactic communications grid had been desynchronized, not broken, desynchronized. The distinction mattered enormously. Breaking a relay node was an accident or an attack. Desynchronizing one required authorization sequences from the highest tier of human government and a precision technical operation coordinated across 32 light years of space. 7 minutes. All of it gone. The chamber went quiet in a way Veth Khan had not heard since the Silence War ended 2 centuries ago. Not the quiet of agreement, the quiet of 9 species realizing simultaneously that none of them had a protocol for this. The Solhari ambassador Prith spoke first, because the Solhari always spoke first. Prith called it posturing, a negotiation tactic. The humans wanted something, a better trade formula, an upgraded council seat, some symbolic gesture they could present to their domestic audience as a victory. She'd watched younger species do this before. Let them exhaust themselves. They'd return when the infrastructure they depended on began to hurt. A few delegates murmured agreement. It fit the comfortable shape of what the conclave believed about humans. Energetic, yes. Innovative, yes. Emotionally unpredictable, certainly. But ultimately tethered to galactic systems they didn't build and couldn't replicate. A tantrum dressed in diplomatic clothing. He did not say anything. He ordered a formal message drafted, polite, measured, requesting clarification on the status of human diplomatic operations, the diplomatic equivalent of checking whether a neighbor's lights were still on. The message was transmitted through 4 independent backup channels, routed through relay stations the humans themselves had helped construct. All 4 bounced.
Not rejected, bounced, returned as undeliverable, not because someone on the other end had refused them, but because the address no longer existed. The human communication architecture in conclave space hadn't gone silent, it had simply stopped being there, like sending a signal to a star that had already gone dark. Veth Khan dismissed the session without issuing a directive. The delegates filed out in tight clusters, their translators humming with whispered speculation, and he stood alone as the atmospheric system cycled and the chamber lights fell to standby. He walked to the human delegation's row. 4 seats. Standard conclave design, adjusted over years of feedback, slightly narrower than the base template, because humans, it turned out, found the standard width subtly uncomfortable. The back support had been modified at Ambassador Yale Okonkwo's request, because human spines, she had explained with great patience, were evolutionary compromises held together mostly by stubbornness. There was a stain on the edge of the console surface, small, dark at the center, the ring-shaped ghost of a cup set down in a hurry. Okonkwo's deputy, a man named Ryan Vasquez, drank whatever hot human liquid they were all so devoted to, as though someone were about to take it from him. Veth Khan looked at the stain for a long time, longer than made sense. His secondary optical cluster, the smaller set, the ones his species considered involuntary and therefore embarrassing, kept drifting back to it, even when his primary gaze moved to the dark panels, the silent headsets, the empty chairs that somehow still held the geometry of the people who had last sat in them. Nobody had cleaned the stain. It bothered him in a way he could not explain and did not wish to examine. 2 light years away, aboard the human diplomatic transport Quiet Hour, Ambassador Yale Okonkwo sat in the communications bay and watched the bounce notification appear on her screen. She read the sender tag, Orath Meridian, Office of the Senior Arbiter, and deleted the message without opening it. Ryan sat across from her. He was looking at nothing. He'd been doing a lot of that. She got up and made him a cup of coffee, set it beside his elbow without a word. He didn't reach for it. The ship hummed around them, the low-frequency vibration of a vessel running quiet through empty space, going nowhere in particular, at a speed that suggested it had somewhere very specific to not be. Through the observation window behind them, the stars of conclave space burned in the arrangement Ryan had spent 15 years learning to navigate. Which system belonged to which species? Which trade corridors ran where? Which clusters of light represented relationships he'd mistaken for friendships, and which represented obligations the other side had never intended to honor? What they found in the dark. 8 weeks before the silence, Kira Solano hadn't slept in 26 hours, and her coffee knew it. She sat in a secure analysis room, 4 floors beneath Earth's Diplomatic Intelligence Directorate in Nairobi, a space built during an era when humanity still believed its largest problems were itself. The walls were reinforced composite and hummed faintly with electromagnetic shielding that made your back teeth ache if you stood too close. Kira had learned to sit in the exact center of the room to balance the discomfort. Across the table, Director Emre Bakir was pulling apart a holographic data projection with both hands, spreading columns of Sulhari trade telemetry like a man sorting evidence he hadn't expected to find. Emre was 51, built like someone who had once run great distances and never fully stopped, and he possessed the particular quality of stillness that came from spending a career inside languages that didn't originate on Earth. Kira had watched him once decode an alien distress signal while eating lunch. He hadn't paused the meal. He wasn't still now. It was embedded in routine Sulhari commercial relay traffic, Kira said, not looking up from her own surface. Buried 3 layers down in the metadata architecture, encrypted with a cipher that uses mathematical frameworks we don't have standard notation for yet. My team spent 11 days breaking it. Emre stopped moving. His hands hung in the holographic light, fingers spread, and he looked at her the way a physician looks at a patient before delivering news that will restructure their understanding of their own life. "It's a containment architecture," she said, "for us." The document was called the Meridian Framework. It had been authored jointly by 5 of the 9 conclave species, the Sulhari, the Vekari, the Horn Collective, the Ossian Reach, and the species known only as the Deep Choir. 5 civilizations working in coordinated secrecy, longer than humanity had been a member of the galactic community. The document was comprehensive the way a trap is comprehensive. Every element placed with care, every gap measured, every angle considered. Phase 1. Ensure humans never achieved voting equivalence on the conclave by tying representation to a civilizational stability index built with benchmarks humanity could not reach for generations. Benchmarks that, Kira noted with a voice that had gone very flat, the authors themselves did not meet by their own definitions. Phase 2. Deny independent transit gate access by burying licensing gates inside trade agreements written at a level of legal complexity that no human legal team, and Kira was certain now that several had looked, would locate the binding clauses until they had already been locked in for decades. Phase 3. Constrain human fleet capacity through mutual security treaties calibrated with extraordinary precision. Large enough that humanity would feel sovereign, never large enough to matter. And then there were the trade negotiations, every agreement humanity had reached across 40 years of conclave membership. Every resource deal, every technology exchange, every shipping contract that Ambassador Okonkwo and her predecessors had argued and celebrated and built careers on. All of it designed, not negotiated. The concessions were calculated, the victories were scripted. The humans thought they were at a table,
They were in a corridor, and every turn they'd chosen had been the only turn available. Emre read the document twice. Then he called Secretary General Adeaze Nwosu. Adeaze arrived at 1 in the morning. She was a small woman whose quietness had mass to it, the kind of quiet that settled into a room and changed its center of gravity. She had held her office for 8 years. In that time, Kira had seen her raise her voice exactly once during a closed council session, and the minister on the receiving end had submitted his resignation before the building's lights came back on.
She sat. Emre projected the meridian framework. Arieze read. Her face did nothing. Her breathing did not change. She read it again. Then she said, "Everyone out. Kira and Emre stay." The room emptied, the door sealed with the sound of a decision already forming. 43 minutes. Kira never told anyone what was said inside those 43 minutes. Neither did Emre. What came out of that room was not anger, though the anger was there underneath everything, deep and cold and very patient. What came out was a choice, and the choice was not to demand explanation, not to confront, not to leak the meridian framework to galactic media, which would have been the satisfying move, the obvious move, and exactly the move the 5 guilty species would have already prepared responses for. No, Adeaze chose the one thing that couldn't be managed because it couldn't be predicted: complete absence. Withdraw every ambassador, close every consulate, end every exchange program, every science partnership, every trade post. Desynchronize the quantum relays. Do it fast, do it clean. 7 minutes. No statement, no ultimatum, no explanation. Let the empty chairs deliver the message. Let them sit in a room with silence where humans used to be, and understand, slowly, that the silence had a shape. Kira asked what they would do when the conclave came looking. Arieze looked at her with eyes that read you like a text in a language you hadn't known you were written in. She didn't answer. On the quiet hour, 2 light-years from conclave space, Yael Okonkwo read her withdrawal orders 3 times. She was 47 years old. She had given 23 of those years to this work, late sessions that bled into pre-dawn mornings, meals shared with delegates whose biology made eating in public a gesture of deep trust. Every small thread of connection built one careful conversation at a time. She had learned enough Sulhari body language to negotiate without translators. She had attended the birth ceremony of a Horn diplomat's 3rd offspring, which involved sustained harmonic resonance and required her to hum for 4 hours. She had done it. She had not complained much. She laughed, reading the orders. It wasn't a joyful sound. It was the laugh of someone who had just understood that the house they built was on land the architects had never planned to give them. Ryan sat across from her. He didn't ask if she was all right. He already knew, and knew she didn't want the question. 90 hours, she said, instead of everything else. That's tight, he said. That's the point. She pulled up the logistics interface and began. Embassy by embassy, consulate by consulate, 23 years of human presence in galactic civilization reduced to columns on a screen.
The staff transfers alone were a nightmare. 300 people scattered across 9 systems, some of them with alien colleagues who had become something more. Alien students who showed up for language sessions on Tuesday afternoons. Alien children who gave them small gifts made by hand. Yael worked through the night. At some point, Ryan said, "The Ossian kid, Sale, the one who gave me the stone thing." Her hands paused. "She's 7, he said. "She's going to think we just left. We did just leave." Ryan didn't answer. His hands didn't move toward his coffee. Outside the observation window, the stars of conclave space burned exactly as they always had, unchanged, indifferent. The worst part was how normal everything looked from out here, while inside the ship, a world was being disassembled.
The wound, the silence left. 20 days into the silence, the conclave sent a ship. It was a Vekari diplomatic vessel, long, pale, constructed from the bioluminescent ceramic that the Vekari cultivated rather than manufactured, moving through space the way its species moved through rooms, with the effortless ease of something that had never once questioned its right to be wherever it was. Arbiter Veth Khan had selected the vessel personally. He had chosen the captain personally. He had written the approach protocol in the formal register used only for negotiations of galactic consequence. The ship reached the boundary of human space in 11 days. A single human frigate was already there, compact, angular. Its hull plating had the look of something designed by a mind that considered beauty an engineering problem, not ignored, but solved with function so completely that aesthetics emerged as a byproduct rather than a goal. Its name was painted in plain white letters on the starboard hull, the Harriet Tubman. The Vekari captain stared at the name for 8 seconds, queried the cultural database, and found the entry. A human who led others to freedom at extraordinary personal risk, who returned again and again when safety was already hers to keep. The captain filed this information carefully and did not find it reassuring. The Harriet Tubman transmitted a single automated message. No voice, no image, just text in standardized conclave trade script. Human space is closed to non-human vessels. No exceptions, no review timeline. The Vekari captain transmitted credentials. He invoked the arbiter's authority. He offered to wait at distance while the message was relayed to human leadership. He cited 15 separate diplomatic precedents and 3 interstellar conventions. The Harriet Tubman did not respond. It held its position, weapons uncovered but dormant, drive cores running warm enough that the Vekari sensors could read the energy signature like a pulse. Not attacking, not retreating, not negotiating, just there. A wall made of silence and hull plating, and one very precise name. The Vekari vessel waited 6 hours, then it turned back toward Orath Meridian. The conclave fractured, not in the open sessions, but in the corridors between them. 6 species who had not been party to the Meridian framework, the Orath, the Limbori, the Tessian, the Vorath, the Null Choir, and the Far Depths, had spent 40 years watching decisions be made about humanity and assuming those decisions were collective. They were learning now, in the slow and ugly way that trust dies, that they had been excluded from conversations that shaped the fate of another species, that the chamber they sat in had a room inside it they'd never been shown. Commander Eflon of the Limbori was the first to say it plainly. He said it in an unsanctioned meeting with the Orath ambassadors, in a room that wasn't on any official schedule.
If they were willing to do this to the humans, they will do it to any of us when the math justifies it. Nobody argued. That was how he knew he was right. He began building a coalition, quietly, not for humanity's sake. Eflon had no particular attachment to a species he found bewilderingly loud and bafflingly devoted to a hot, bitter drink they consumed at all hours of their biological cycle. He was doing it for the Limbori, for the Orath, for every species that voted on resolutions in that chamber without understanding that the outcome had been arranged before the session opened. Ambassador Prith watched this happen and could not stop it. She tried, with the precision of someone who had been doing this long enough to understand that precision was all she had left. The Meridian framework had been necessary, prudent. Humanity expanded at a rate that had no precedent in conclave history. They innovated without guardrails. They adapted to alien environments with a speed that bordered on biological aggression. In 2 generations, they had spread across 41 systems. They learned languages and customs and technologies at a pace that should have taken centuries. They needed structure. Every new civilization needed structure. The framework wasn't hostility, it was stewardship. The argument had weight, it had logic, it had been sufficient for 30 years, but it had a fracture in it now, and the fracture was this: the containment hadn't worked. The humans hadn't pushed against the limits. They hadn't discovered the framework and demanded confrontation. They hadn't leaked it to galactic media, or issued ultimatums, or done any of the things the Meridian authors had prepared responses for. They left, cleanly, completely, in 7 minutes. The species the framework had described lacking civilizational maturity had executed a coordinated withdrawal across 9 star systems with a precision that made the Vekari intelligence service look like it was still learning its own protocols. And they did it without threatening anyone, without explaining themselves, without asking for anything at all. That was the part that troubled Preeth most deeply, though she would have sooner removed her own spinal crest than admitted it. The humans hadn't demanded a seat at the table. They hadn't overturned the table. They had found a door no one knew existed and walked through it calmly, and the sound of it closing had echoed through the conclave like nothing before it. Veth Khan made a second attempt. This time he sent the Orath, a neutral species by reputation and biology, built for gentleness, their commitment to non-aggression encoded deep enough that it had reshaped their evolution. Their envoy carried no weapons and broadcast open-frequency peace signals from the moment it left Orath Meridian. By every measurement the conclave had ever developed, it was the least threatening object they could possibly transmit. It reached the boundary of human space and received the same automated message. But 5 seconds after the automated reply, a secondary transmission arrived, short, unencrypted, tagged with a diplomatic signature the Orath captain recognized. Ambassador Yael Okonkwo, former chief human representative to the Galactic Conclave. The message contained 11 words. We know about the Meridian framework, all of it. The next conversation happens on our terms. The Orath captain transmitted the message to Orath Meridian. It arrived during a full conclave session. Veth Khan read it on his private screen, his primary eyes tracking the words, while his secondary cluster, the small, involuntary ones, the ones his species considered beneath dignity, fixed on the empty human seats across the chamber. He ended the session early, citing procedural necessity, and stood alone in the chamber as the lights dimmed. He walked, as he had walked every evening for 20 days, to the human delegations row. The 4 seats, the dark panels, the headsets in their angled cradles. And there on the console surface, still there, 20 days later, preserved by a cleaning cycle someone had quietly disabled for this section, the dark ring of a cup left in a hurry. He did not know who had turned the cleaning cycle off. He had not ordered it. He stood there for a very long time, his 6 hands resting on the cold console, and understood, in a way that could not be argued with, that the species he had helped contain was already somewhere beyond the edge of what the Conclave's models had imagined. They hadn't broken the cage. They had simply decided the cage wasn't worth their time. And that, Veth Khan realized, standing in the dimmed chamber with his eyes on a coffee stain, was the most complete answer to the question the Meridian framework had presumed to answer. Were humans mature enough to be equals? They hadn't needed to prove it by fighting. They had proven it by leaving. And now the galaxy was sitting in a room full of empty chairs, finally understanding what the chairs meant.
The cost of quiet. 40 days in, the numbers began to speak. Director Emre Bakir sat across from Secretary General Adeza Nwosu in her office, a room that looked nothing like what you would imagine if you pictured the leader of a unified human government. Adeza had refused every renovation offer. The desk was from her predecessor's predecessor. The light came in through windows that faced the wrong direction for the afternoon sun. She had hung nothing on the walls. Emre laid out the figures without cushioning them. V-Light crystal reserves at 9%, he said, down from 34 at the start of withdrawal. The Kepler 7b colony is rationing heat already. 2 months more and they're choosing between power and communications. The interstellar transit network loses reliable coverage of the outer 17 colonies if we extend maintenance deferral beyond 60 days. After that, we're looking at genuine isolation for populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Adeza was reading something on her tablet that wasn't what Emre was discussing, which was her method of listening more completely than any other person in the room. "How does the other side look?" she asked. Emre almost let something cross his face. He said carefully, "It turned out that humanity, across 40 years of enthusiastic engagement with galactic civilization, had made itself into something that no one had fully mapped until it was missing. Not a military power, not an economic engine, something stranger. Something the Conclave's models hadn't accounted for because the models were built by species who measured power in fleets and votes and resource tonnage. Humans brokered. They sat between species that could not communicate directly, not because of language, but because of history, biology, status, grudges older than most human civilizations. The Sulhari and the Limbori hadn't spoken face-to-face in 2 centuries. They hadn't needed to. There was always a human in the corridor between them, translating not just words, but intention, smoothing the gaps that no machine translator could bridge, because the gaps weren't linguistic. They were old and personal and precise. Ambassador Okonkwo had spent 9 years managing the Sulhari-Limbori resource corridor. Both sides believed consistently that they had gotten the better arrangement. That was her particular gift. She made everyone feel like they had won without anyone being wrong about it. Now she was on Titan Station, doing paperwork.
Human shipping firms had operated 43% of cross-species freight lanes, not because human vessels were superior, they weren't particularly, but because human crews had learned everyone's protocols. Every species had different docking standards, different atmospheric requirements, different gravitational preferences, different ideas about which end of a cargo bay was the correct end. Most species learned their own system and expected the galaxy to adapt. Humans had learned all of them, not as strategy, as habit, as the particular human reflex of showing up somewhere and immediately trying to understand how it worked. Those lanes were empty now. 3 conclave homeworlds were reporting supply chain failures. The Sulhari Agricultural Coordination Network, a system that moved processed nutrition across 5 star systems and supported life for nearly 3 billion beings, had slowed to crisis pace because the logistics coordinators who maintained its timing sequences were human, and the humans were gone. Ambassador Prith was receiving emergency calls from her own government. The irony was flawless and terrible. The species she had argued required containment was the species her civilization's food distribution infrastructure depended on. The species they had quietly caged was the species holding the key to their grocery system. Meanwhile, on Titan Station, the withdrawal continued in the form of paperwork and cargo manifests, and a woman from the Orath Cultural Exchange who wept openly when she learned her human teaching partner had already departed without being able to say goodbye. Yale handled the diplomacy of leaving, the last official acts, the final transfer authorizations, the careful language of ends. Rian handled the people. This was how they had always worked. It was the last time they would work this way, in a place that still smelled of the particular mixture of 9 alien atmospheres that Rian had spent years learning to identify by species. One afternoon, he spent 2 hours packing his office. 15 years of diplomatic life reduced to containers. A carved resonance stone from the Limbori, a traditional gift for those trusted enough to be given one, shaped to fit the exact dimensions of the recipient's palm. A woven sash from the Tessian that shifted color with the wearer's body temperature. A small ceramic piece from the Horn Ambassador, made by hand, technically designed for a liquid mildly toxic to humans, but Yale had kept it on his desk for 6 years because the gesture was sincere, and sincerity was its own kind of treasure. And at the bottom of the box, a small stone figurine, made slightly lopsided by a 7-year-old Ossian child named Sale, who had given it to Rian after he spent an afternoon teaching her to skip rocks on the station's recreation deck. She had been terrible at it. She loved every minute. Yale set the figurine in the box. Rian said, "Leave the lid open." She closed it. He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. The box was a box, the figurine was a figurine, and somewhere on an Ossian station, a 7-year-old was wondering what she had done to make the tall human who taught her to skip rocks walk away without a word. The answer was that she had done nothing. She had just been born into a galaxy where the adults in charge of it couldn't be trusted with their own rules. Meanwhile, on the Sol boundary, the edge of human space, Captain Devon Osai sat in the command chair of the Harriet Tubman and watched the same Vicari cruiser he'd been watching for 9 straight days do absolutely nothing of consequence on his sensor display. Devon was 32. He had joined the diplomatic navy because he liked the specific kind of quiet at the edge of known space where you could feel the size of things. Standoffs, he was discovering, were a different kind of quiet, the kind with teeth. His communications officer interrupted his 7th hour of disciplined stillness with something that was not nothing. A transmission, not from the Vicari ship, from a Limbori personal frequency, unregistered, layered in encryption, routed through 4 neutral relay nodes specifically to avoid conclave surveillance. The sender identified himself as Commander Ethlan. Ethlan wanted to speak, not through the conclave, not through official channels. He was offering information, the complete Meridian framework, unredacted, plus internal conclave communication records showing which species had advocated hardest for each measure, who voted for what and when, and the full timeline of the conspiracy. Everything. In exchange, he wanted one thing: assurance that when the silence ended, because Ethlan was clear-eyed enough to understand it would end, one way or another, the 6 species who had no part in the Meridian framework would not be held accountable for what the other 5 had done without them. Devon read the message twice, then he routed it to Nairobi with a priority flag and went back to watching the Vicari cruiser not move. The message reached Emre Bakir at 2 in the morning. He read it, said something unprintable with great feeling, and called Adaze. Adaze read Ethlan's offer in her small office with the outdated furniture. She read it the way she read everything, completely, once, with the patience of someone who knew that decisions made at 2 in the morning had consequences that lasted centuries. When she finished, she set the tablet down and asked a question no one in the room anticipated. "What do the Orath think?" Emre stared. "The Orath? The ones who sent the peace envoy, the neutral party. What is their read on all of this?" It was the first time in 40 days that Adaze Nwosu had asked about anyone who wasn't human. Emre said he would find out. Adaze nodded. She looked out her window at a sky holding more stars than anyone could count, each one a system where someone was living with the consequences of the silence she had chosen. The weight of it pressed against the walls like water behind a dam, and Adaze Nwosu sat in the center of it, holding everything still with nothing but clarity and the knowledge that stillness sometimes was the most powerful force in a room.
The table they built themselves. The waypoint station had been dead for 7 centuries. It drifted in the deep between 3 systems that no longer had names, built by a civilization that had joined the conclave, contributed greatly, and then ceased to exist in the way civilizations sometimes do, not violently, not spectacularly, but with a slow forgetting, like a phrase drifting out of use until the language no longer remembers it had the word. The station was their last structure, a meeting place, neutral and old, designed for conversations that couldn't happen anywhere else. Human engineers reactivated it in 3 days. They repressurized the chambers. They patched the hull with components cannibalized from their own support vessels. They rigged the atmospheric systems from parts designed for 4 different species and made all of them work together with the particular human talent for improvisation that operates somewhere between genius and stubbornness. They powered the whole facility with a portable reactor from the Secretary General's own transport. When the Vicari advance team arrived to inspect the site, they found it functional, temperature stable, and this was the detail Veth Khan would think about for years afterward, stocked with coffee. Not as diplomacy, not as symbolism, simply because the humans who had set up the station couldn't work a long shift without it, and they hadn't thought to apologize for that.
Adese arrived on a single transport, no escort fleet visible on long-range sensors. Every species present understood without needing to be told that not visible and not present were very different concepts when applied to a civilization that vanished from 9 star systems in 7 minutes. She brought Yael Okonkwo as ambassador, Rian Vasquez as operations lead, Emre Bakir as intelligence counsel. 4 people. That was the entire human delegation for the most consequential diplomatic meeting in 40 years.
Yale wore a jacket that had never quite fit right. It had never fit right. 23 years of representing humanity to the galaxy, and she had never solved the problem of formal clothing that felt like her own skin. She had stopped trying to solve it sometime around year 9. Veth Khan arrived with a delegation of 10, one representative from each species that had agreed to attend. Prith was there because she had no choice. Ethlan was there because he had made certain of it. The Orath sent their eldest diplomat, a being named Vaveth, who moved like a stone that had learned patience and who possessed more optical sensors than seemed necessary, but used every single one. The chamber was circular. The humans had arranged it that way. No head of the table, no elevated position, no architecture of authority, just a ring of seats with no hierarchy visible in the geometry. A to Z's execution. A to Z opened the meeting. She did it with a gesture no one anticipated, including Yael, who had worked alongside A to Z for 6 years and still could not predict her the way you cannot predict a weather system that operates by its own internal logic. She projected the Meridian framework. The complete document, unredacted, every page, every clause, every phase of the 30-year containment timeline, floating in the center of the room in holographic light that made the alien script glow like something that was simultaneously beautiful and damning. The 6th non-framework species saw the full document for the first time. Ethlan's neck spines went flat against his skull. Vaveth's many eyes moved across the text with the slow, relentless pace of someone reading their own absence from a decision that had affected them deeply. A to Z did not read the military section. She did not read the trade manipulation clauses or the 70-year timeline. She read one line written in Veth Khan's own formal diplomatic register, the one reserved by Vekari custom for statements of permanent civilizational truth. The human species, while energetic and resourceful, lacks the civilizational maturity to participate as equal partners in galactic governance. She let the words remain in the center of the room. She did not argue with them. She did not raise her voice or pound a surface or perform the emotional display the conclave had spent 40 years expecting from humanity's representatives when pressed. She simply stood, a tired woman in a room full of beings who collectively underestimated what she represented, and let the silence finish the sentence the words had started. Then she said, "That was written 40 years ago. I would like to know if you still believe it." The chamber held its breath. Veth Khan sat across the circle. All 6 hands rested on the table. His primary eyes held A to Z's gaze with the steadiness of a species that had been practicing diplomacy before humanity discovered writing. His secondary optical cluster, the small, involuntary ones, the ones Vekari culture considered undignified to acknowledge, was fixed on the empty space beside A to Z, on the ghost of a chair that wasn't there,
on a console surface 300 light-years ago that still held a dark ring where a cup had been set down in a hurry. He was quiet for a very long time, long enough that Prith shifted in her seat, long enough that Eflan's neck spines began to lift, long enough that Yael, standing behind A to Z, began running through contingency protocols in her head. Then Veth Khan said 4 words that had not been spoken by a sitting arbiter of the Galactic Conclave in 360 years of recorded history. I was wrong, completely. Prith's head turned, the slow, controlled rotation of a predator who has just identified a sound from a direction that should have been safe. Veth Khan did not look at Prith, he looked at A to Z. That document, he said, is the proof, not because your species found it, because your species responded to it with more discipline, more restraint, and more strategic intelligence than the 5 who wrote it. You did not demand justice, you did not escalate, you chose the most difficult option available, you simply stopped being where we expected you to be. And in doing so, you showed every species in this room what civilizational maturity actually looks like. The negotiation that followed lasted 14 hours. It was not dramatic. It was not moving in the moment. It was 200 beings arguing about voting formulas and transit gate licensing and treaty dissolution mechanisms and the legal architecture by which the Meridian framework would be disclosed to every member species of the conclave, not as punishment, A to Z insisted, but as precedent. If it was possible to do once in secret, it would be possible again. The only protection that worked was transparency, and transparency, she noted, was not selective. Prith fought every clause. She fought with the endurance of someone who knew the outcome and had decided that surrendering slowly was less catastrophic than surrendering completely. She conceded independent transit gate access at hour 5. She conceded voting equivalence on an 8-year implementation schedule at hour 9. She conceded full framework disclosure at hour 12, when the non-framework coalition voted as a unified bloc and the arithmetic became irresistible. Eflan watched from his seat at the table. He did not celebrate. His expression was the expression of someone watching a structure come down and calculating whether the debris would reach their position. At hour 14, A to Z called a recess. The delegates dispersed into the station's corridors, where the humans had arranged appropriate atmospheric zones for each species, and this detail again, this stubborn human detail, food. Someone had researched the dietary specifications of all 10 species present. Someone had sourced or synthesized the appropriate items. Someone had labeled everything in 6 languages with full allergen notation.
It was Rian. Of course it was Rian. Yell found the observation alcove alone. It was a small space at the station's uppermost point, with a curved viewport facing deep space. No significant stars, no landmarks, just the pure, unstructured black of the space between systems, the emptiest address in the universe. She still wore the jacket. She'd given up on the collar at hour 6. Her hands hung at her sides. She was 47 years old, and she had spent 23 of those years in chambers where she was always, somehow, almost the right shape for the furniture. The friendships had been real. That was the part that ached. The late nights with Vicari delegates who confided things they shouldn't have. The meals with beings whose biology made sharing food a declaration of trust.
Sale's little lopsided figurine, sitting now in a sealed box in cargo hold 3, all of it real, and all of it built on a foundation that 5 species had engineered to quietly collapse the moment humanity became too comfortable inside it. Rian found her. He always found her. He set a cup on the railing beside her. She picked it up and held it without drinking. "We going back in?" he asked. She looked out at the nothing, the vast, indifferent dark that she had, for 23 years, learned to navigate by the light of other people's stars. "Yes," she said. "Different this time?" She thought about that. Below them, the ancient waypoint station turned slowly in the void, alive for the first time in 7 centuries, lit from within by borrowed light and the particular stubbornness of a species that had been told, in carefully constructed diplomatic language, that it was not ready. They had responded the only way that actually mattered. They had shown up anyway, and they had made the coffee.